After Kennedy's assassination, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, assumed the presidency. Johnson promised to ensure passage of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill as a memorial to the slain president. However, Southern conservatives continued to fight the legislation. So President Johnson went to work, using the experience he had gained as Senate Majority Leader.
Johnson displayed his really extraordinary political skills and power in being able to transform what had been a Washington in which civil rights legislation was impossible into one in which it was enthusiastically embraced.
The landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited racial discrimination in public accommodations, forbade discrimination by employers, and banned the use of different voter registration standards for blacks and whites. Now Johnson was ready for an even greater challenge. Like President Kennedy, Johnson had been greatly influenced by Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, which painted a wrenching picture of poverty in America. Johnson was inspired to commit billions of dollars to this cause. The war on poverty, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were to be the centerpieces of what Johnson called the Great Society. His first victory in the war on poverty came with the passage of the Economic Opportunity Act, which created a variety of social programs designed to help people improve their lives, such as Job Corps, which provided training for the unemployed, and Head Start, an educational program for poor preschool children. In the 1964 presidential election, Johnson beat his Republican challenger, Senator Barry Goldwater, by a landslide. This lopsided victory also brought with it a large number of liberal senators and congressmen who shared Johnson's belief in the beneficial power of government. The new Congress passed numerous programs, including Medicare, a health insurance program for the elderly, and Medicaid, medical insurance for the poor, and federal aid for education. President Johnson also proposed legislation to reform U.S. immigration policy. Since World War I, U.S. policy had been based on a quota system that favored European immigrants. The Immigration Act of 1965 opened doors to more diversity, resulting in an increase in America's population of Asian and Hispanic people. As President Johnson pushed for his Great Society, several decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court had a great impact on civil liberties. The court banned prayer and Bible reading in public schools to protect the rights of religious minorities. The landmark case, Gideon versus Wainwright, required states to provide poor criminal defendants with an attorney, and Miranda versus Arizona required the police to inform criminal suspects of their rights. Johnson's Great Society was built on the assumption that America's booming economy would continue producing more than enough revenue to meet the government's needs. But Johnson hadn't taken into account the expense of fighting the Vietnam War. With the costs related to troops and equipment, there simply wasn't enough to adequately fund the Great Society programs, and many experienced cutbacks. In addition to taking a toll on the country's economy, the war was dividing the American people as well. On March 31, 1968, President Johnson stunned the American people by announcing that he would decline to run for re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
With the nation in mourning, America's new president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, received a recommendation from the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the United States take firm measures to help the South Vietnamese. But the president could not send U.S. troops into combat without agreement from the Congress, as the Constitution provides. However, in two separate incidents in August 1964, American Navy destroyers reported being fired upon by North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The North Vietnamese accused the ships of spying, President Johnson called the attacks an open aggression on the high seas and asked the Congress for authority to respond. Many would later question whether the first attack had been provoked or if the second ever took place at all. At the time, though, the Senate passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution by a vote of 88-2, giving the President extraordinary power to act. This controversial incident would signal the beginning of active involvement of U.S. forces in Vietnam. In February 1965, 6 months after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, President Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a large bombing campaign against military and economic targets in North Vietnam. In addition to the bombing, President Johnson authorized a buildup of U.S. strength on the ground. At the beginning of 1965, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, General William C. Westmoreland, had 25,000 troops. By the end of the year, he had nearly 200,000.
Westmoreland concluded that the most effective way to defeat the enemy was to search him out, find him, and then use America's overwhelming superiority in terms of firepower, not in terms of personnel. There were more of them than us, but we had bigger guns.
But finding the enemy was not easy. Ordinary farmers by day could become deadly Viet Cong guerrillas by night.
If you were an American soldier, being able to distinguish between who was a friend, who was neutral, and who was an enemy was virtually impossible.
The Viet Cong knew how to use Vietnam's jungles to hide and lay ambushes. U.S. forces countered by spraying defoliants, like Agent Orange, to kill off the foliage and make it more difficult for the enemy to hide. The U.S. chemical arsenal also included napalm, a jellied gasoline, which could be dropped in bombs or used in flamethrowers. The burning gasoline stuck to whatever it hit, making for a devastating weapon that often claimed many civilian casualties. Those weapons were part of General Westmoreland's strategy to win the war not in any single battle, but in a steady war inflicting heavier and heavier losses on the enemy until it became too weak to fight. This strategy required large numbers of American troops. By the end of 1967, there were almost 500,000 American servicemen and women in Vietnam. But instead of demoralizing the communist forces, the massive U.S. presence seemed to make them more determined to fight. In November 1967, General Westmoreland had assured the American people that his strategy was working, that U.S. forces had killed so many enemy troops that the war would soon be over. Inside the Johnson administration, however, there were growing doubts about the success of the war. According to the CIA, the massive bombing campaign over the North was having little effect, and morale among the North Vietnamese showed no signs of weakening. As a result, the Pentagon asked President Johnson for permission to expand the areas the U.S. was bombing in the North. Johnson refused. He feared that expanding the war would fuel the growing anti-war sentiment at home.
Hell no! We won't go!
Opposition increased even more in 1968, when the North Vietnamese launched an all-out attack on the South, known as the Tet Offensive. In January 1968, during a ceasefire for Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese attacked more than 20 cities and towns in South Vietnam. The targets included urban areas that were supposedly safe from Viet Cong attack, including Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. From a military perspective, the Tet Offensive was a costly failure. The Viet Cong were almost eliminated as an effective fighting force, while the North Vietnamese army suffered heavy casualties. From a psychological perspective, however, the Tet Offensive was a stunning success. Pictures on American television screens showed that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were capable of attacking anywhere in South Vietnam, undermining General Westmoreland's claim that the war would soon be over. In the wake of the Tet Offensive, General Westmoreland asked President Johnson for still more troops. Facing growing anti-war protests at home, Johnson refused. In March of 1968, a tired and frustrated President Johnson went on television to announce that he had ordered a halt to air and naval bombardments of North Vietnam. And in closing, he shocked the nation, declaring,
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
But Johnson's announcement did little to quell opposition to the war. At the forefront of the protest was what observers called the New Left. In the beginning, it was made up mostly of middle-class college students who were inspired by the civil rights movement to become politically active.
There is now a cohort of people ready to say the United States can do wrong things. And not only that, but we know how to protest. We're not afraid to get out in the street. We're not afraid to march. We're not afraid to take on authority. We're not afraid to say the government is wrong.
In April 1965, one of the New Left's leading groups, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, organized the first anti-Vietnam War March on Washington, which drew tens of thousands of protesters. Some protesters broke the law by burning their draft cards. Others set fire to the American flag in protest. Perhaps the most dramatic anti-war demonstrations occurred in the summer of 1968 during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. While delegates inside the convention hall went about the business of nominating their presidential candidate, Johnson's Vice President Hubert Humphrey, protesters outside battled police. For 2 days, police and National Guard troops, using clubs, rifle butts, and tear gas, squared off against protesters throwing rocks and bottles. Resistance to the war took many forms other than mass protests. Some young men who were drafted to serve in Vietnam refused to go, claiming a special exemption granted to conscientious objectors. Many other young men tried to avoid the draft by claiming physical disabilities. Others simply left the country. Three months after the Chicago riots, Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election.
Just hours after the murder of the president, Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas took the presidential oath of office aboard Air Force One. Almost immediately, Johnson sought to marshal the grief of the nation behind the cause of Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill that had been languishing in Congress for months.
This bill is going to pass if it takes us all summer.
He clothed himself in the legacy of the martyred president. And even when he was going well beyond what President Kennedy hoped to achieve, he used the mantle of the assassinated ex-president as a way of trying to build support for his program.
Faced with a filibuster by Southern senators, Johnson used his own matchless political skills to push the bill through.
He was a master of the political process, better than almost anyone else of his generation. He rested his skill on knowing intimately the needs, wants, desires, and fears of all of the legislators. But more than anything else, it was the skill in face-to-face communication and lobbying, literally getting in people's face, and that defined the Johnson treatment, a mixture of cajoling, flattering, browbeating, threatening, praising, that worked wonders.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law.
After 83 days of debate, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in July of 1964.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 may be the great achievement of the liberal era of the 1960s and of the Johnson presidency. More than anything else, it led to the end of the system of segregation in the United States and to the integration of public life.
It had real procedures against petty apartheid, lunch counter, hotel, restaurant, movie theater segregation. Just lifted this awful stigma that somehow black people weren't good enough to go to this movie, weren't good enough to go to this restaurant. Just wiped that away almost instantaneously. And it also had educational provisions that helped advance what Brown had begun almost 10 years earlier.
The following year, the violent suppression of a voter registration drive in Selma, Alabama, added momentum to Johnson's push for a federal voter protection.
With the eyes of the nation and the world upon what was happening in the South, Johnson felt that he had to take a principled stand.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America.
In March of 1965, Johnson went before the country and issued an address to both houses of Congress in which he calls upon the lawmakers to pass a Voting Rights Act. And this was now the President of the United States using the anthem of the Civil Rights Movement.
And we shall overcome.
The results were spectacular. By 1968, approximately 60% of African Americans in the South were registered to vote, and now you began to see more black elected officials in the South.
But at the same time, it also helped to make Southern politics, if anything, more conservative.
After the achievement of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, when those bills had finally been enacted, Johnson turned the next morning to Bill Moyers, one of his top White House aides, and said, "We've just delivered the South to the Republican Party for my lifetime and yours." And that prediction turned out to have been largely true.
Johnson's commitment to civil rights was part of a larger vision to transform society by taking the ideas of the New Deal to a new level.
The Great Society is a place where every child can find knowledge to enrich his mind and to enlarge his talent. It is a place where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community.
His idea of the Great Society is that you improve everybody from the bottom up. And if you can do that, then the whole society moves forward, and it does become a great society.
Reporters called it a political miracle as the 89th Congress passed measures mandating an anti-poverty program, education subsidies, a massive housing program, urban renewal, arts funding, consumer protection, highway safety, pollution control, environmental preservation, and more.
Central to the idea of the Great Society was that there would be something for everyone, that you would improve not only people's standards of living, but the quality of life in the United States. A cleaner environment, for instance, would be part of that. Opportunities for higher education and the life of the mind. But the real focus would be on those people left behind by the prosperity of the 1960s.
The most far-reaching of the Great Society programs, Medicare and Medicaid, extended government-financed medical care to the elderly and the poor.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
The war on poverty increased some direct income support to poor people in the form of food stamps, rent supplements, and aid to families with dependent children. But the greatest benefits accrued to the elderly and to depressed rural regions through economic development initiatives.
They actually changed what it meant to be poor in the United States. The elderly and rural poverty, those were taken off the table by the very success of the Great Society. But that then only drew more attention to the one area of impacted poverty that seemed least amenable to the kinds of things that liberal reformers like Johnson were doing. And that was persistent urban poverty in the ghettos of the nation's cities. They had to deal not only with the social and economic underpinnings, but of the role of racial injustice in creating those poverty populations. And in the end, Johnson tried a variety of very ambitious measures to deal with those programs, but with only very mixed success.
John F. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963, left the nation in a state of shock and despair. Within hours of the tragedy, Kennedy's vice president was sworn into office aboard Air Force One. Number 36, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Democrat, 1963 to 1969, age 55, from Texas.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down.
The day after the assassination, Johnson pledged to dedicate his presidency to the fulfillment of Kennedy's legacy. How well Johnson actually enacted Kennedy's presidential agenda was another matter. Johnson was not happy about the way he gained the presidency, but once he had it, there was much he wanted to do.
He was just insatiable about being a great politician. He wanted to be the greatest president in the country's history.
Johnson had risen from poverty to become a hugely powerful politician. He was a larger-than-life character, alternately charismatic and crass.
Oh, Lyndon Johnson, he was one of the smartest human beings I've ever met. He was cunning. It was kind of like being an animal in the jungle. He didn't read, he wasn't a scholar, but he just was so clever and so aware of people and what they did and so able to analyze them. And then he had this kind of volcanic personality, up and down. He was on certain days a little nuts.
He had a ego problem as big as his own hat. He felt inferior dealing with all these Ivy League people, and he occasionally overreacted to that and pushed these people around just to prove he could do it.
Johnson had an in-your-face management style. At 6'2", he overwhelmed people to get what he wanted. It became known as the Johnson treatment.
The Johnson treatment was getting in people's faces and bullying them, shouting them, bribing them, whatever, to get his own way.
And you didn't know whether it was a gesture of friendship or a gesture of trying to dominate. I think in Johnson it was both.
Besides the treatment, Johnson gained the upper hand by holding meetings in unconventional places. He was skinny dipping in the White House pool when he called for two of his aides to come and listen to his Great Society proposal. This was Johnson's vision of America, realizing its true promise, a democracy with freedom and justice for all.
And he believed wholeheartedly in this vision. It was to raise the underprivileged and the discriminated against to new levels of equality if he could.
Johnson's Great Society resulted in an explosion of new laws. The Voting Rights Act, Medicaid, federal aid for education, environmental protection laws, food stamps, Head Start, National Public Radio, the Public Broadcasting System, consumer protection laws, and the Civil Rights Act.
No president wanted to do more for African Americans than Lyndon Johnson. Civil rights was absolutely at the core of his commitment to a better America, to a great society.
Lyndon Johnson's going to go down in history for one reason, and that's for civil rights.
Johnson also expanded on Kennedy's efforts to fight a war on poverty, and he succeeded, eventually cutting the percentage of those who lived in poverty by half. Winning the war in Vietnam, however, was another matter. In June 1965, General William Westmoreland
warned Johnson that he risked losing the war unless he mobilized the reserves, committed more firepower, and doubled the troops from 65,000 to 125,000. Johnson authorized sending 100,000 more troops, but even then, America came no closer to winning the war.
How could it be, he kept asking, that these Vietnamese guerrillas, these guys running around the jungles in black pajamas, could stand up to American military power, to our superior firepower, our technology? This he couldn't fathom, couldn't quite square that with the reality.
At home, the anti-war movement gained momentum. What had started as Truman's containment policy was now Johnson's war.
I spoke to Mrs. Johnson about this, and she said he heard those protesters marching up and down in front of the White House, shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And it was a wound in his heart. He suffered terribly, she said, over the fact that so many boys were dying.
The enemy of freedom has chosen to make this year the decisive one.
The last year of Johnson's presidency began with the devastating Tet Offensive. The bold North Vietnamese advance on Saigon made victory look remote, perhaps impossible. At home, Johnson faced opposition within his own party, from Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. Under fire, Johnson decided not to run for re-election.
Fellow Americans, I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Lyndon Johnson, I think, is the most tragic of all of our American presidents, because no man fell from a higher pinnacle, and no man sought more not to be a war president.
At the end of his term, Johnson tried to negotiate peace with Vietnam, but failed.
I think Johnson's reputation will make a comeback. I think he will be seen as, if not a near great president, but pretty darn close to it. Because in the domestic realm, there is no president other than Franklin Roosevelt who achieved more than LBJ. I think in time, as this Vietnam issue fades somewhat, he'll be seen, I think, as a more effective president than he's been seen in recent years.
Johnson liked the soft drink Fresca so much that he had a soda fountain installed in the Oval Office that dispensed only Fresca.
In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, with his civil rights bill still being debated in the House of Representatives. His death was a blow to the movement, but his successor, Lyndon Johnson, took up the cause and pressured the Congress to pass what became known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This measure outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations and in the workplace, and tried to break down barriers to black voters in the Deep South.
I'm Idell Craft, and I'm working for the Board of Registration here in Greenwood.
The summer of 1964 became known as Mississippi Freedom Summer, as a diverse group of civil rights advocates tried to register black voters in Mississippi. Many whites in the state strongly resisted the effort. Some even resorted to violence, killing 3 young civil rights workers. In February 1965, a small voting rights march in Selma, Alabama, erupted in violence and ended in the death of a black activist. Outraged, civil rights advocates held another march on Sunday, March 7th. In an effort to stop the marchers, Governor George Wallace sent 200 state troopers armed with tear gas, nightsticks, and bullwhips. The violence was so severe that the event became known as Bloody Sunday. 2 weeks later, Martin Luther King Jr. organized another march from Selma to Montgomery. This time, though, President Johnson ordered National Guardsmen, Army troops, FBI agents, and U.S. Marshals to protect the marchers. At the end of the march, 25,000 people gathered on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol to call for an end to voter discrimination. Later, in 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The legislation was designed to fight the persistent discrimination in voting in southern states. Results came quickly. In 1964, only 23% of eligible African American voters were registered in the South. By 1969, the number had almost tripled to 61%. Even though segregation laws had ended and African Americans had won the right to vote throughout the South, economic and social discrimination against blacks continued. In contrast to the nonviolent tactics of Martin Luther King Jr., support began to build in parts of the black community for more forceful measures to promote change. Malcolm X, a Muslim minister and member of the Nation of Islam, came to be the most vocal spokesman for this movement. His slogan, "By any means necessary," illustrated how strongly he opposed Dr. King and his nonviolent approach to civil rights. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam also opposed the concept of racial integration.
Has integration solved the problem or made it worse? When you integrate a white community seeking better housing, history here during the past 10 years has proven that the whites cut out. They flee to the suburbs, and the community that you thought you were integrating soon becomes another all-black slum.
Malcolm X was assassinated by rival members of the Nation of Islam on February 21, 1965. But his ideas formed the basis for a new generation of black leaders who had become frustrated with the nonviolent tactics of Dr. King. One such group, started in Oakland, California, called themselves the Black Panthers.
The Black Panthers saw themselves as one of the many revolutionary parties in the United States that was willing to challenge the economic structure. Their style of presentation, with afros, with black berets, with black leather jackets, with their leadership in Oakland originally carrying weapons openly, certainly that image presented an image of danger to the American public.
The radicalism of the Black Panthers expressed the anger and frustration felt by many African Americans facing persistent discrimination in housing, education, and employment, particularly in urban areas. From 1965 to 1967, that frustration exploded in race riots across the country. Some of the most serious riots were in the Watts district of Los Angeles, Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan, where many people were killed and thousands injured. On April 4, 1968, a devastating blow was dealt to the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by a sniper outside his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee.
Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene.
Shock and outrage at King's murder sparked riots in more than 130 cities.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
A few months later, on June 5, 1968, presidential candidate and former Attorney General Robert Kennedy was murdered. His assassination came just after winning the California presidential primary with a campaign that pledged to bring the races together. The deaths of King and Kennedy in 1968 marked a dramatic loss of leadership for the civil rights movement. The African American struggle for justice, however, had lit a fire under other minorities who now began to push for their civil rights. In the 1960s, many Latinos living on the West Coast were farm workers. Many farm owners exploited these workers by routinely ignoring state laws regarding working standards. In 1962, led by the dynamic Cesar Chavez, the National Farm Workers Association, NFWA, was formed to try and improve working conditions. Like Dr. King, Chavez employed nonviolent tactics to achieve his goals. In 1965, the NFWA, later to become the United Farm Workers, began a strike against grape growers in California. Chavez and the NFWA also organized a successful consumer boycott of grapes that were not picked by unionized labor. By 1970, most grape growers had agreed to contracts with the farm workers. Later, California Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill, the 1975 Agricultural Labor Relations Act, that established collective bargaining laws for farm workers.